we got the calls about 11:30, and
Thick black smoke billowed from the roof of Buckingham Palace late last night, drawing immediate emergency responses from across the city. While firefighters managed to contain the blaze before it reached the main residential wings, newly leaked security camera footage has ignited a massive controversy. The video reveals an unidentified individual moving freely through a supposedly locked service corridor moments before the flames erupted. This shocking revelation has transformed a routine structural fire into a high-stakes security investigation, threatening to expose major vulnerabilities at the very heart of the monarchy. The midnight blaze red flames licked against the tall Gothic windows of the old service wing. A security guard threw his weight against the heavy wooden door. It gave way with a loud crack. Thick black smoke poured out into the courtyard. He coughed and raised his radio to his mouth. He called for the fire brigade. He shouted that the East Annex was fully ablaze. Within minutes, 3 red engines raced through the main gates with sirens wailing. The facts are that Buckingham Palace houses miles of ancient electrical wiring, much of it dating back to the mid-20th century. Structural surveys had warned about the aging grid for years, yet full upgrades had been repeatedly delayed due to the massive cost and the disruption to royal events. When the fire broke out just past midnight, the main breaker in the basement tripped instantly. It cut power to half of the administrative blocks. Tension filled the smoke-filled corridor as firefighters dragged heavy canvas hoses across the carpet. Water sprayed against the hot stone walls. Steam hissed into the air. The team leader pushed past the inner threshold. He aimed his thermal camera into the dark room where the fire had started. The screen showed an intense pocket of heat centered entirely around an old storage closet. It was an isolated burn zone. It did not spread outward from a wall outlet. The facts were that electrical fires usually trace back to overloaded sockets or frayed internal cables. The investigators from the City Fire Brigade began inspecting the charred remains of the wall panel. They found no evidence of a standard short circuit. The circuit breakers for that specific wing had been manually switched off from the master box 20 minutes before the alarm sounded. The mystery was who had gone down to the basement control room to flip the switches before the fire started. The access log for the breaker room required a dual key system and a digital PIN code. Only 2 people on duty held the active credentials for that shift. One was a veteran engineer who had been working there for 30 years. The other was an external contractor who had signed in earlier that evening under a temporary pass. The mystery resolved when the duty manager checked the digital sign-in sheet for the lower level. The external contractor had logged out at 11:40 in the evening. However, the security camera facing the basement stairwell showed no footage of him leaving the building. The video file for that 15-minute window had been cleanly deleted from the local storage drive. The facts were that the fire was not an accident caused by old infrastructure. It was a deliberate act designed to destroy a specific physical space. The storage closet that burned to the ground was not used for old furniture or cleaning supplies. It held the backup paper ledgers for the estate maintenance accounts from the last decade. Every single financial record stored inside was reduced to ash. A new mystery opened as firefighters cleared the charred debris from the back corner of the room. They found a heavy iron lock box sitting beneath the fallen timber. The box had survived the worst of the heat because it was shielded by a thick concrete pillar. The lid was closed, but the metal casing was warped from the temperature. A fresh scratch mark ran across the keyhole. Someone had tried to force it open before the flames were ignited. The fire chief walked over to the box and knelt down in the soot. He called for a forensic officer to bag the item immediately. He knew this was no longer a simple structural emergency. Someone had used a controlled fire to cover up a burglary, or to destroy evidence that could not be wiped from a digital server. The smoke began to thin as the ventilation fans cleared the air. The smell of burnt timber and melted plastic hung heavy in the hall. Guards stood at either end of the corridor to block unauthorized access. The investigation team took their positions around the ruined closet. The palace was holding its breath. The ashes were still warm, but the secrets buried within them were already starting to surface. The leaked footage. A laptop screen glowed in the dark office of the palace security annex. A private investigator clicked a mouse. A video file started playing on the display. It showed a deserted corridor on the ground floor of the East Annex. The timestamp in the corner read 11 past midnight. A man in a dark hoodie walked into the frame. He did not look at the security cameras. He walked with a steady, purposeful stride straight toward the service wing. The facts are that Buckingham Palace has thousands of closed-circuit cameras monitoring its perimeter, courtyards, and internal hallways. The footage is fed directly into a central security hub, monitored 24 hours a day by trained personnel. However, during major staff shift changes late at night, certain blind spots exist where camera angles overlap imperfectly. This specific video had been pulled from an auxiliary backup drive that was supposed to overwrite itself every 48 hours. Tension filled the small room as the man on the screen reached the door of the storage closet. He pulled a small metal tool from his pocket. He jammed it into the lock of the door. The latch clicked open in less than 3 seconds. He stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The hallway remained empty for 12 minutes. Then, a thin trail of gray smoke seeped out from under the wooden frame. The mystery was why the internal alarm system did not trigger when the door was forced open. Every service door in that wing was wired with a magnetic contact sensor. Opening a door without a security badge should have sent an instant alert to the main control desk. Yet, the watch log showed 0 alarms registered for that sector during the entire night. The mystery resolved when the investigators zoomed in on the door frame in the video. A small piece of clear plastic had been wedged over the magnetic sensor earlier that evening. It kept the system from recognizing that the circuit had been broken. Whoever broke into the room had inside knowledge of the palace security hardware. They knew exactly how to blind the sensors without cutting the power to the rest of the floor. The facts were that the intruder did not wear a standard uniform or a visitor badge. His face was partially shadowed by the hood of his jacket, but his movements were smooth and practiced. He did not wander around testing doors. He walked straight to the target room with absolute certainty. He knew where the paper ledgers were kept. He knew which closet held the physical evidence from the past decade of estate accounts. A new mystery opened as the video progressed past the moment the fire started. The man came back out of the closet. He was carrying a heavy canvas satchel under his arm. It was bulging with documents that had not been burned. He did not run away from the smoke. He walked calmly down the opposite end of the corridor toward an unmonitored service exit that led directly to the mews. The investigator paused the video. He looked at the face of the man as he passed under a wall sconce. The hood slipped back for a single frame. The investigator recognized the profile immediately. It was a senior logistics coordinator who had worked for the private office of the Queen for over 15 years. He was one of the few people who had retained his security clearance after the recent administrative purge. The investigator picked up his desk phone. He did not call the regular palace switchboard. He dialed a private encrypted number that connected directly to Princess Anne's personal secretary. He told him that the fire was not an accident. He said he had video proof of a targeted theft carried out by a member of the inner staff before the flames were even lit. The secretary told the investigator to lock his office and stay where he was. He said Princess Anne was already on her way down to the annex. The investigator set the phone back on its cradle. He looked at the paused frame on the screen. The man in the hoodie stared back from the pixels. The cover-up was unraveling. The fire had failed to destroy all the evidence. The door to the office swung open. Princess Anne walked into the room. She was wearing a heavy trench coat over her evening clothes. Her face was grim. She did not waste time with greetings. She pointed at the screen and told the investigator to play the footage from the beginning. She pulled a chair up to the desk and leaned forward. She watched every second of the video in absolute silence. When the video ended, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Anne did not look surprised. She looked angry. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window. She looked out at the dark courtyard where the fire engines had parked hours earlier. She knew the person on the screen was just a pawn. Someone higher up had given the order to burn the ledgers. She turned back to the investigator. She asked if a copy of the video file had been uploaded anywhere outside the palace network. The investigator nodded. He said he had sent a secure backup to a trusted legal firm in the city, just in case anything happened to the local drives. Anne gave a sharp nod of approval. She told him to keep the original file secure and to prepare for a long morning. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The fire had not been designed to burn down the palace. It was a desperate attempt to erase the final physical traces of a corrupt administration before the ongoing investigations could reach them. The security footage had caught the thief in the act. The truth was no longer hidden in the ashes. The cover-up attempt. A heavy leather binder lay open on the long mahogany table in the press office. A senior communications officer reached across the pages with a red correction pen. He crossed out 3 lines of text in a draft statement. He wrote a new sentence in the margin. He looked up at the 2 junior press officers standing by the door. He told them to release the revised draft to the morning news agencies immediately. He said the official line was that a faulty electrical cable had caused the fire in the East Annex. The facts are that Palace media managers are trained to handle crises by containing the narrative within the bounds of standard operational accidents. When structural damage occurs, attributing the cause to aging 19th century infrastructure is the safest deflection. It avoids awkward questions about security breaches, internal theft, or missing physical ledgers. The draft statement explicitly blamed an old wiring fault behind a wood-paneled wall. It omitted any mention of the broken lock or the missing paper archives. Tension filled the room as one of the junior officers hesitated before taking the paper. She asked if the press corps would buy the electrical fault story, given that the fire brigade had already recovered a forced lockbox from the room. The communications officer stopped writing. He put his pen down on the wood. He told her that what the fire brigade found was none of the public's concern. He reminded her that her job was to distribute the approved text and answer no follow-up calls. The mystery was how the media team had managed to draft a detailed explanation of a structural failure less than 2 hours after the flames were extinguished. Usually, forensic teams require 24 hours to inspect a burn site before issuing any safety conclusions. Yet, the press office had received a signed memo from the administrative director at 3 a.m, ordering them to blame the wiring. The mystery resolved when the officer noticed a second document tucked under the draft statement. It was a maintenance log dated from 3 weeks ago. It showed that the electrical wiring in that specific storage closet had been fully inspected and upgraded during the spring maintenance window. The cables were brand new. They could not have sparked a fire on their own. The electrical fault excuse was a complete fabrication manufactured to cover up the break-in. The facts were that the administrative director, who signed the memo, was the direct supervisor of the logistics coordinator seen on the security footage. He had rushed the false statement into production before the police forensics unit could secure the room. He was trying to establish an official record of an accident before physical evidence of arson could be verified by independent inspectors. A new mystery opened as a phone on the central desk began to ring. The communications officer stared at the blinking red light. It was a direct line from the Home Office press desk. He picked up the receiver on the 4th ring. He listened to the voice on the other end for 20 seconds without speaking. His face turned pale. He lowered the phone slowly onto its cradle without saying goodbye. The junior officers watched him with nervous eyes. They asked who was calling. The officer told them that the government press office had just received an anonymous tip containing the security footage from the East Annex corridor. He said the media agencies were already preparing to run a story about a forced entry and a stolen canvas bag. The official cover-up had collapsed before the morning papers even hit the streets. He grabbed the red correction pen and drew a massive X across the entire draft statement on the table. He told the staff to recall all copies immediately. He said there was no longer any narrative to control. The press office doors swung open as a team of Metropolitan Police officers walked into the room unannounced. Their lead investigator flashed a warrant and demanded all digital drafts related to the East Annex fire. The room went completely silent. The paperwork slid off the edge of the table and scattered across the carpet. The administrative cover-up was over. The police had stepped in to seize the office computers. The true nature of the midnight fire was about to be exposed to the entire nation. Princess Anne's investigation. Princess Anne walked down the damp stone steps of the East Annex basement. Her boots clicked against the floor with sharp echoes. She held a small metal flashlight in her hand. The beam cut through the lingering haze of smoke in the corridor. 2 uniformed police officers stood guard outside the charred doorway of the storage room. They stepped aside and saluted as she approached the threshold. She did not nod back. She ducked under the yellow police tape and stepped inside the ruined room. The facts are that Princess Anne retains an official oversight role regarding estate security and property maintenance across royal residences. While she does not normally lead forensic criminal investigations, her direct intervention was requested by the senior police commander on duty. The local force recognized that investigating a crime scene inside an active royal palace required a senior figure who could legally bypass internal administrative blockades. She was there to ensure the physical evidence was preserved before palace bureaucrats could tamper with it again. Tension filled the small, soot-darkened room as she shone her flashlight across the fallen ceiling timbers. The air still smelled heavily of burnt paper and chemical retardant. She walked carefully over the debris toward the back corner, where the iron lockbox had been recovered earlier that morning. The heavy concrete pillar overhead was cracked from the intense heat, but the ground around its base had been cleared by the forensic team. She knelt down on one knee to inspect the floorboards. The mystery was why a specific section of the wooden floorboards had been pried up with a crowbar before the fire was ever ignited. The forensic markers showed that the planks had been removed and replaced loosely. Anyone looking at the surface casually would have noticed nothing unusual, yet the burn pattern on the wood indicated that a flammable accelerant had been poured directly into the subfloor cavity beneath the box. The mystery resolved when one of the investigating officers handed her a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a fragment of a water-damaged paper ledger that had fallen between the floor joists and escaped complete destruction. Anne brought her flashlight closer to the plastic. The visible text on the fragment showed a series of unrecorded financial disbursements routed through an overseas account bearing the initials of the Queen's former private office. The facts were that the storage closet was never intended to hold general estate furniture. It had been converted into a secondary archive vault used to store off-the-books accounting documents. These papers tracked every transaction that bypassed the official Privy Purse Oversight Committee. The fire was an intentional demolition job designed to incinerate those specific records before the parliamentary auditors could request them. A new mystery opened as Anne ran her gloved fingers along the inner edge of the concrete pillar. She felt a small metallic ridge embedded in the stone. She used the edge of her metal flashlight to scrape away a layer of soot. A small, square panel popped open with a faint click. It revealed a hidden wall recess measuring roughly 12 inches across. The interior was completely empty. The officers leaned in to look at the cavity. Anne asked if the inventory team had cataloged anything recovered from that specific wall compartment. The lead detective shook his head. He said the local log showed no record of a hidden wall compartment existing in the architectural plans of the East Annex. Whoever built it had kept it entirely off the official palace blueprints. Anne stood up and dusted off her coat. She told the detective that the empty recess had likely held the primary master ledgers, the ones detailing every unauthorized asset transfer executed over the last 10 years. The canvas bag carried away by the logistics coordinator on the security footage had not just contained random paperwork. It had held the contents of that exact hidden wall box. She walked back toward the doorway of the ruined room. She paused at the threshold and looked at the scorched doorframe. She told the officers to impound the entire subfloor section and transport it to an independent forensic lab outside London. She said nothing inside the annex was to be moved or signed off by palace administration without her explicit written consent. The investigation was moving past the initial cover-up and digging into the structural foundation of the palace itself. The fire had exposed a network of hidden vaults and secret accounts that the royal establishment had spent years concealing. Anne stepped out of the smoky corridor and back into the clean air of the courtyard. The search for the master ledgers had only just begun, and the trail was leading straight to the highest levels of the household. The threat to historical archives. A heavy oak door stood ajar at the end of the long parchment archive room. A senior archivist rushed across the parquet floor. He clutched a white cotton pair of gloves in his left hand. He stopped abruptly at the threshold. A fine layer of gray soot covered the top of the glass display cases. The air smelled of scorched leather and damp paper. He dropped his gloves onto a side table and ran straight to the main humidity monitor on the far wall. The facts are that the Royal Archives house irreplaceable historical documents dating back over 300 years. These papers include royal charters, handwritten letters from monarchs across the centuries, and vital genealogical records. The archive rooms are located directly adjacent to the East Annex service wing. When the midnight fire broke out, the heat barriers separating the two zones were subjected to temperatures far exceeding their rated engineering limits. Tension filled the vast room as the archivist pulled open the metal drawer of a climate-controlled cabinet. He flicked on his pocket penlight. He inspected the fragile parchment map stored inside the bottom slot. The paper was bone dry, but the edges of the storage box were warm to the touch. The fire had come within 6 feet of breaching the outer plaster wall of the primary manuscript vault. The mystery was why the automatic fire suppression gas system in the archive corridor had failed to activate during the incident. The system was designed to flood the sector with inert gas the moment ambient temperatures crossed 70 degrees Celsius. Yet, the pressure gauges showed the tanks were completely sealed. The system had been deactivated manually from the central maintenance panel earlier that week. The mystery resolved when the archivist checked the manual shut-off logbook kept inside the curator's desk. The log showed a signed entry authorizing a temporary maintenance override for the archive fire suppression sensors. The signature belonged to the same administrative director who had tried to fabricate the electrical fault story. He had disabled the safety systems in the archive wing to ensure that the water sprinklers would not ruin the hidden wall vault during the planned demolition job. The facts were that the historical archives were treated as collateral damage by the conspirators. They had knowingly risked centuries of British history just to ensure the physical ledger books in the adjacent room were completely destroyed. If the fire had breached the plaster partition by even a few more inches, thousands of priceless national treasures would have turned to ash alongside the off-the-books accounting papers. A new mystery opened as the archivist noticed a small leather-bound journal missing from its designated display pedestal near the back wall. The glass case was intact, but the latch was unfastened. The missing item was not an ancient medieval charter. It was a personal diary kept by the late sovereign containing administrative notes from the transition period of 2020. The archivist picked up his desk phone and dialed the security annex. He reported the missing diary immediately. He stated that someone had bypassed the secure glass case during the chaos of the evacuation. The theft proved that the intruder had not just stolen the financial ledgers from the subfloor vault. They had also targeted specific personal records that could link the current administrative corruption directly to past royal decisions. He set the phone down and walked slowly back to the display case. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. He realized that the archives were no longer a neutral sanctuary of history. They had become a battleground for control over the narrative of the crown. The physical protection of the past was compromised, and the staff no longer knew who to trust within the walls. The heavy double doors at the entrance of the archives swung open. 2 forensic officers walked in, wearing blue protective shoe covers. They asked the archivist to step away from the display cases so they could take fingerprint dust samples from the glass. The investigation was moving deeper into the heart of the palace. Every room held a new piece of evidence, and every shelf concealed another secret waiting to be uncovered. The government steps. In a red telephone sat on the corner of the polished oak desk in the Prime Minister's private office. The screen flashed with a high-priority alert code. A senior policy advisor lifted the heavy receiver to his ear. He listened for 10 seconds without uttering a single word. His hand gripped the plastic so tightly his knuckles turned white. He thanked the caller and slammed the phone down onto its cradle. He turned around to face the Prime Minister standing by the window. The facts are that the British government holds a constitutional duty to monitor major structural crises involving royal properties, especially when public safety and state archives are directly compromised. While the monarchy operates under sovereign independence, Parliament controls the funding allocations and civil infrastructure budgets that maintain royal buildings. When a midnight fire reveals a deliberate cover-up, forged safety override logs, and stolen administrative ledgers, Westminster cannot look away. The incident ceases to be a private family matter and becomes an urgent national security review. Tension filled the quiet office as the Prime Minister walked over to the desk. He asked if the palace administration had provided an official explanation for the security breach yet. The advisor shook his head. He said the palace press office had tried to blame an old wiring fault before police raided the building and seized their draft statements. He handed over a thin manila folder containing the initial intelligence brief sent by the Metropolitan Police Commander. The mystery was why the Home Office had received anonymous copies of the security footage from the East Annex corridor hours before the official police report was finalized. Someone within the inner administrative circle was leaking raw evidence directly to government ministers to force an immediate public investigation. They wanted to ensure the palace could not sweep the arson attempt under the rug. The mystery resolved when the advisor pointed out a specific name listed in the police transport log. The person who delivered the secondary data drive to the parliamentary security desk was none other than a disgruntled junior secretary who had worked under the arrested administrative director. She had downloaded the entire digital archive of the cover-up before resigning from her post that morning. She handed over the proof because she knew she would be made the scapegoat for the fire. The facts were that the evidence now in the hands of the government painted a devastating picture of institutional corruption. The documents proved that senior staff members had manipulated maintenance schedules, bypassed fire suppression systems, and burned physical records to hide years of unauthorized financial transactions. The scandal was no longer confined to internal palace gossip. It was a matter of public law. A new mystery opened as the Prime Minister opened the second half of the folder. A formal letter from King Charles was clipped to the back of the police brief. The king requested a full parliamentary inquiry into the estate management accounts. He stated clearly that the crown would cooperate fully with state investigators. Why would a reigning monarch invite an external government audit into his own household? The advisor looked at the Prime Minister and gave a quiet answer. The king knew he could no longer protect the corrupted elements of the household without destroying the credibility of the entire crown. By inviting Parliament in, he took control of the narrative. He ensured the cleanup would happen under state supervision rather than through chaotic media leaks. The Prime Minister picked up his pen. He told his advisor to draft a formal statement announcing an independent parliamentary commission into royal property security and financial management. He said the first hearings would begin by the end of the week. He signed the authorization order with a swift, clean motion. The political machinery of the state was now fully engaged. The walls of secrecy that had protected the palace administration for decades were crumbling away. The fire in the East Annex had burned down more than a storage closet. It had burned away the barrier between royal privilege and public accountability. The government was stepping inside, and the rules of the institution were changing forever. The Prime Minister walked back to his desk and sat down in his high-backed leather chair. He looked across the room at the stack of official documents detailing the palace fire. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. A direct confrontation between Parliament and the royal household had not occurred in this magnitude for over a century. Every move they made would be scrutinized by the press and the public. The facts were that the inquiry would require testimony from senior palace officials, external contractors, and financial auditors who had managed the estate funds. The investigators would have to trace every missing pound from the hidden wall vault to its final destination in offshore shell companies. No stone could be left unturned if the government wanted to restore public faith in the administrative integrity of the crown. Tension mounted in the cabinet room as senior ministers gathered for an emergency briefing later that afternoon. The Chancellor of the Exchequer expressed concern over how the public would react to the news of millions of pounds being diverted from regional royal tours. He warned that the revelation could trigger widespread calls for a reduction in the sovereign grant. The mystery was how the financial discrepancies had managed to bypass the National Audit Office for over 10 consecutive years. The state accountants review royal spending annually to ensure public funds are used efficiently. Yet, the off-the-books accounts were operated through a separate legal entity that claimed total exemption from standard parliamentary scrutiny. The mystery resolved when the lead legal counsel explained the archaic loophole used by the palace administrators. They had classified the transactions as private duchy revenue rather than public grant expenditure. This clever legal fiction allowed them to shield